Thanks everyone for coming out. We're going to start the day easy, right? Let's start it with economics. That way it gets more and more difficult as the day goes on. Normally as a host of Planet Money, and I'm sure for a lot of you who are professors out there too, my job is to take things that are extremely complicated and to try and make them simple. What we're going to do this morning is take something very simple and try and make it more complicated. We're talking about economic security, and specifically we're going to talk about universal basic income, UBI. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, there's an even simpler way to put it, which is give people money. The government can simply take money in some form or another and distribute it to every single citizen of the United States. Now, the amount of money people talk about differs. Some people say, oh, well, $500 a month, $1,000 a month, $1,500 a month. The exact number doesn't matter, because what matters is this fundamental shift in our relationship with the government, where the government could give money to people and for the first time not put any particular strings attached to it. You could spend the money on housing, you could spend the money on food, you could spend the money on alcohol and video games. You could go on a vacation, you could invest the money, you could pay for your kids' education. It is saying to the people of the United States, we trust you and we think that you are the best person who can make a decision about your money. So what we wanted to talk about today was sort of a little bit of the history of UBI and to really get into some of the implications of it, because this idea, it's so simple, has been around for hundreds of years, mentioned by John Stuart Mill in the 1960s, conservative economist and Nobel Prize winner Milton Friedman suggested this. Richard Nixon looked at a version of this, and today it is all the rage among tech billionaires, Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, and Andrew Yang, who is running for president of the United States. And it would be interesting to put them all in a room to see if they could agree on anything, despite the theoretical concept of this. But instead, we are going to bring this panel to you and sort of hash out some of the details today. I have to my left Ioana Marinescu. She's an assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania School of Social Policy and Practice. Matthew Continetti, founding editor of the Washington Free Beacon, and Albert Wenger, managing partner of Union Square Ventures. So I'm going to begin with Albert. So 200 years of just batting around this idea. Why does it seem to be going viral now? Like, what is the problem that UBI is trying to solve?
Well, the reason I think people are starting to come around to this idea some more than before is because we've made a dramatic leap in technological capability. And if you look at human history, previously when we've made dramatic leaps in technological capability, we changed a lot about how we live. So, you know, we have had sort of a prehistory as foragers for hundreds of thousands of years, and then 10,000 years ago we invented agriculture, and we kind of changed pretty much everything about how we live by going from the forager age to the agrarian age. And then a few hundred years ago we had the Enlightenment, we invented science and steam power and electricity and mining and chemistry, and we changed pretty much everything about how we live. And I think there's a growing group of people, myself included, who believe that digital technology isn't some like continuation of industrial technology, but digital technology is as profound a transition, as profound a change in our set of capabilities as those earlier technological breaks. And as a result, many of us believe that we need as big a change in how humans live as those two prior transitions represented. And UBI is one, not the only, but one central aspect of a transition to a world where we're not all of our attention is trapped in this sort of go make some money so you can live, so you can buy stuff that's made by other people who go make some money. And I think the reason this is particularly important today and related to the Green New Deal is because we're finding ourselves at the sort of precipice of a extraordinary environmental, almost potentially extinction level event for humanity. And so it seems that not only do we have a new set of technological capabilities that offers a lot of opportunity, but we also have an extraordinary threat. And when you put those two together, you should probably seize the opportunity to fundamentally rethink how human society is kind of organized, the way we've done twice before. That's, I think, why this idea is getting more attention today.
That was very nuanced. I noticed you didn't just say that robots are going to take all our jobs, so we should give people money.
Well, there's no doubt that we can build amazing robots, and the word robot I will use very broadly. But I think at all points in history, it's wrong to believe that there's some kind of materialism, some kind of deterministic process that decides what happens next. I think people have fallen in the trap of technological determinism, materialist, historical determinism all the time. It's a set of choices that we get to make. We can choose which of these paths we want to be on, and depending on what we choose, we will automate different things. Right now, we're putting a lot of effort into automating things that are very, very expensive. If you are a radiologist, I get pitched by startups probably once a week that will basically do away with the need for radiologists. If, on the other hand, you're cleaning toilet bowls, I don't get pitched by startups that are building toilet bowl cleaning robots. And just try and think about which one is a high-paid job and which one is a low-paid job. So I think we have lots of choices, and I wouldn't frame this as, oh my God, fear of robots. It's more like, what do we want to choose? How do we want to choose to live?
Ioana, you've looked at a lot of the data and the experiments about UBI. So we're 200, 300 years into this idea. What's different now? What do we know now that we didn't know a couple hundred years ago about this idea?
So I think over the years, evidence has accumulated from a number of social experiments, and in fact, the negative income tax under Nixon was the first large-scale social experiment in the US where a UBI has been tried for a experimental sample of subject, and it was a randomized control trial just like you do in medicine. Since then, there's been other such trials and similar studies that have been done. So if I can summarize for you what we've learned, I wrote a review of literature on all that has happened there. One of the biggest worries with universal basic income that people commonly have is that it would disincentivize people from working. In other terms, if you get money for nothing, why should you get up in the morning? And it turns out that practically speaking, most studies find either no effect or very small effect on work. So I think in terms of what this would do, even though the future might not be like the past, certainly this doesn't seem to be a major concern. The second thing is that this has improved health, especially mental health. Interestingly, there was no increase in the use of substance like alcohol and drugs. The opposite being true, improvement in depression and anxiety. And finally, people have also looked at education, and the UBI has improved education, and especially among low-income people. So all these effects on health and education are particularly strong among the most disadvantaged. So that just kind of gives you an overview of what we've learned. Now, of course, it's a bit of a guess game what would happen if you put UBI on a large scale. And that's where my recent work on Alaska is a little bit more, it's closer to what you'd do if you had the UBI for everybody. The important difference is that if you do a small experiment, you're just putting in a tiny bit of money in the economy. So that's not going to change, the macro aspect of things, right? It can affect people's individual behavior. It's not going to change the macro aspect. But in Alaska, they've had something like a universal basic income. It's not called that. It's the Alaska Permanent Fund Dividend.
Which comes from their oil.
From their oil, exactly, from 50 years. Interestingly, though, it doesn't come directly from the oil. It comes from a sovereign wealth fund where they invested their oil, and it's the dividend from that the Alaskans are getting every year. So looking at this, where, again, every Alaskan gets that, we can look at the impact on the whole Alaskan economy. And, being a labor economist, I was very interested in this impact on work. So what we found is that, on average, the employment in Alaska after they introduced this did not change. So, how do we do this? Well, we compare Alaska with similar states, right? The most similar states that we had before this happened. And we look at whether the employment in Alaska went down relative to these other states. It turns out, essentially, in every year since the dividend was introduced, the level of employment in Alaska was exactly the same as in the control states. In other terms, no change in employment after this was introduced. And then we thought, this is strange. Economic theory says that you should have some decrease in employment because, as I was saying, the intuition is, well, if people have more money, why work? But what we identified there is a macro effect. And that's why, I want to help us think about, hey, if we do this on a big scale, things could be a bit different. So in this case, what happens is that people who get this transfer, what do they do with it? Well, they go out, they go to coffee shop, to restaurants, to local retails. That stimulates, those businesses who then want to hire people. And so this effect counterbalances the desire of some to work less. And so it turns out that in Alaska, those two things more or less exactly balance each other out. On the other hand, maybe people wanted to work a bit less, but on the other hand, there was some job creation. And on net, we didn't see any decrease in employment after this was introduced. And this is only something that you could measure with a big-scale experiment. With a small-scale experiment, right, it's not going to make a dent in the business revenue that people get if you just give it to 100, 200 people, right? So this is something that we can only learn from a larger-scale experiment, and I think here the results are quite encouraging.
All right, so we are facing a uncertain, a little bit of a scary future. We have a series of studies that say that, listen, it doesn't have a negative effect, it has some positive effects. Matthew, should we fundamentally change our relationship with government?
It remains to be seen. I'm the least expert in UBI on this panel, but I am the most expert in Washington. And as Washington's ambassador to this panel, I'm going to leaven it with a healthy dose of DC cynicism. And that is, the Family Assistance Plan, which Ioana mentioned, was proposed into the Nixon administration and authored by Daniel Patrick Moynihan. And it came one vote to passage in the Senate in 1970, but it failed. And it failed, I think, for the same reasons that would militate against the introduction of a UBI anytime soon. I think the first question is, do we view UBI as a supplement to the American welfare state or as a substitute to it? And one reason why you have such kind of transpartisan views of the UBI is precisely this. You'll find libertarians who for many years, for decades, have supported a UBI as a substitute to the American welfare state. The idea being that if you can replace all of the bureaucracies, all of the panels, all of the mechanisms for distribution and paternalism with a simple check every month, then you'd find many libertarians and many even conservatives who would be very supportive of that. But that's not how it's ever happened. This is the issue. And of course, there are also plenty of people on the progressive side of the spectrum who actually believe that one of the functions of the welfare state should be somewhat paternalistic. That if we are giving money to individuals, particularly at-risk individuals, we should wonder whether they're spending the money on healthy behaviors or unhealthy ones. So this is one big question, I think, that determines a lot. Because UBI is not just a quantitative difference in the American welfare state, because it would cost a lot of money. It would be a qualitative difference, which is that the welfare state, as constructed, has kind of been premised on a bargain. And the bargain is that if you're capable of work, you're expected to find a job, particularly males who are eligible to join the labor force. But that if you are incapable of work, if you were disabled, or if you were a widow, or if you were a dependent child, the American welfare state will be there to help you. If we introduce UBI, that bargain changes, because now everyone is eligible for the benefits of the welfare state. And even though the way that it's been proposed in 2020 by Andrew Yang is to suggest that the monthly benefit would be so small as to not have any disruptive effect, Our history with past entitlements is such that the second benefits are introduced, they create constituencies, in this case, the largest possible constituency, the entire population, that militate for their expansion. And so with UBI, I think there are reasons to be skeptical, not only for its practicality, or whether it would ever come into existence, but also the effects it might have on the American welfare state.
And some, so we know the kind of scale we're dealing with here. Some calculations, it depends on how much money you want to give out, but some calculations say if you give $1,000 a month to every US citizen, we're talking around $4 trillion. The current budget.
That's a gross number, right? I mean,
it's a gross number.
No, it's a gross number in
Yes,
the sense that
yes.
it does not take into account that most people would pay much of it back in taxes in any case. So I think that I want to comment quickly on the welfare system, and I think there's many problems with the welfare system as it exists today, but one that you didn't mention that I think is really profound is that the welfare system actually represents the biggest disincentive to work. So if we're talking about what is people's willingness to work under various schemes, most people who are essentially trapped in various parts of the welfare system are in a situation where their marginal tax rate is often in excess of 100%.
Plus one on that.
So what I mean by that is, if you were to take on a job, you would lose more in benefits than you would make from this job. And so one of the attractions of a UBI-style system is that it doesn't lead to those kind of distortions, because you can start to work, you don't lose your UBI. Any dollar you earn is an incremental dollar. And of course, and this is where people go, well, you want to not just introduce UBI, you also want to change the tax system. Yes, we would have to change the tax system. It doesn't make sense with the existing tax system. And this is why I think it's so important to understand that we are at this threshold where we have to revisit everything. And the whole mistake of the last 20 years of politics has been a politics of incrementalism, when that incrementalism is no longer getting the problem solved. That's, I believe, how we wind up with things like Trump and Brexit and so forth, is because there are more people who are like, this incrementalism isn't getting the job done.
So
Yeah, go ahead.
Can I add something on this is sounding very grand, but there are, and talking back to Washington, ways of thinking about, well, incrementalism, ways at least that would be a first step towards a UBI, and there are several things, but for example, earned income, we have one of the biggest policies that redistributes income to low-earning people is the earned income tax credits. But that, of course, is conditional on work. So that the whole idea is you work and then we're going to give you an additional tax credit on top of that. So it's very popular with economists, myself included to a large extent, but really everybody is on it. It's great, etc. But I think we're rethinking things a little bit today because over time, well, two things. First of all, it's been obvious from the beginning that this is going to not be able to help those people who aren't working. For whatever reason, they have care responsibilities, they are sick, etc. So basically, you're leaving the poorest of the poor to the side through the system. That has long time been known, but now we have more quantitative evidence to measure how many people are being left out. But secondly, and that's perhaps more profound in terms of the evolution of the evidence, there's a new working paper by Henry Cleven at Princeton, which hasn't been published yet, so this is still going through the process, but looking at the impact of the earned income tax credit on work. Again, one of the big reasons why we love earned income tax credit is that it encourages people to work. That's what it's supposed to do, rather than discouraging them. Well, all these findings that, earned income tax credit encourage people to work, it seems that they're actually very fragile. Maybe it hasn't had such an effect because the biggest expansion in earned income tax credit is one of the times where we had the strongest economy under Clinton, and that, it turns out, likely much overestimating the, positive effects of earned income tax credit on work. So then if assuming, just for a second, for the sake of argument, and I'm not saying it's been proven, assuming that the earned income tax credit doesn't actually encourage work, okay, let's have that in our mind just for a second. In that case, the earned income tax credit is merely saying we're going to give money to the poor but not very poor, and we're going to leave out all the people who are really poor without making any difference, in terms of encouraging work. So I think this is, for example, one example that leads us to rethink policy, and I'm bringing this up because there's a new bill that's been introduced called the Boost by one of the members of the squad. I don't remember who, if anyone has followed, where the idea is to give something like the earned income tax credit to everybody, including those who have zero money. And now this is getting more towards a negative income tax, which was the whole idea that Friedman originally advocated. So I think there are small, concrete ways how the debate is moving, both through the evidence that we're accumulating in academia and the activism, in DC. No, this is not going to pass today or tomorrow probably, but this is how policy gets done. We do it again and again, iterations, and we're thinking about where we might be going and sort of taking next steps from there.
But why think so big? I mean, it is an elegant idea, but if I'm hearing here that our real problem is people who are poor and not working, people whose jobs are threatened by changes in the economy, people who are marginally attached to the workforce, it's a nice idea to give it to everybody, but it seems like you identify the problem and deal with a narrower version of the problem, which may have a better chance of passing in DC. Why everybody? Why me?
Well, I do think that the past several years has opened the door for radical proposals. By the way, on all sides of the political spectrum. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned the president or Brexit, the type of national populism we see in Europe, that's all happening on the right, obviously more deadly and awful forms of extremism. But that kind of openness toward fundamental change is also reflected on the left in not only proposals for UBI or the Green New Deal, but structural change to the United States. And so the response when I say this has no chance of passing would be to say, well, that's under the government of the United States as constituted today. That is to say, with an electoral college, with a filibuster in the Senate, with equal representation among states in the Senate. And what you find coincident with proposals for UBI or the Green New Deal are also proposals to change that constitutional structure, which may end up being even more difficult than this. It actually makes UBI look, moderate by comparison.
Well, Matthew makes a great point. I mean, the title of this conference is, I think, Green New Deal, Vision or a Bad Idea, something along those lines. One of the, things to understand about the Green New Deal, whether one agrees with it or disagrees with it, is that it has an aggressive timeline for making the economy carbon neutral, which is sort of a 10-year timeline. I had a conversation with somebody earlier before the beginning of the conference, because I often ask people to try and see whether they understand how severe and imminent the climate crisis is. And what I found is that even among very well-educated people, their understanding of the physics of the climate crisis tends to be off by 1 to 2 orders of magnitude. So I'm not talking a little bit off, I'm talking dramatically off. And so the physics of what's happening with the Earth's atmosphere are going to force very large changes, whether we want them or not. And so the only way to get to carbon neutral in a 10-year time frame is to make very radical and dramatic changes. And in my mind, if we're going to go tackle that, which we should and really have to, we should make tackling some of these other issues that have sort of accumulated over 100+ years of industrial age, we should solve them in a package. So I am all in favor of a package. Personally, I would love to see a Green New Deal that has a UBI instead of a jobs guarantee.
So I want to jump in right now to say that that's actually technically possible, and there is a proposal that is on the table. There's been multiple bills already, smaller scale, but through the carbon tax and dividend. So, one of the proposals that's right now actually a bipartisan, has some bipartisan appeal, mostly among centrist, technocratic Republicans, but it's this idea of taxing carbon and then the revenue would be rebated to everybody, just every one of us, no strings attached, in cash. So basically it's a UBI. Now the amounts could be small or large depending on how high we're going to set the carbon tax. And right now the discussions that are on the table would give you small amounts. If we wanted to be much more aggressive in terms of meeting environmental goals, this would be an interesting, and in my view, one of the most elegant ways today of raising money, because all economists are in favor of the carbon tax. It solves a fundamental market failure, failure to internalize externalities or the pollution that we're having here. And at the same time, it could lead us to have a new pot of money to redistribute it back to the people. So I think this is a really worthwhile idea to think more about, and especially in the context that we're having today of talking about the Green New Deal.
I'd like to ask some sort of specifics about the implementation of a UBI. And some of these may be naive questions, but they come to mind, which is, okay, if you give everyone an extra $1,000 a month, and I'm a landlord, why wouldn't I just raise rents by $200, $300? Especially on the people who I feel like couldn't go elsewhere.
So that's a great question. So basically, economics tells us that that is going to depend on the elasticity of supply. Okay, so basically, jargon here, but the intuition is very simple, which is whoever is producing, whether it's landlords or other people who are selling us stuff, how much do they respond to the increase in demand, right? So the idea is you put money in those people's pockets, why don't producers raise prices or landlords raise rents? Well, it depends. What you would expect is that in areas where the elasticity is low, meaning that it's hard for producers to give you more of that, then it could have an effect like this. So a place like Manhattan, it's really hard to build. So this is a place where economic theory would tell us that if you give people a lot of extra money, there's a good chance that rents will go up because it's very hard to get additional building. In a place like Las Vegas, probably not much effect. There's still a lot of space to build more. So the effects are going to be quite different depending on what sort of goods or service we're talking and what place in the country. Right now, we're doing a study on Alaska to look at some of these effects. Is there going to be a price effect in various areas in Alaska? Stay tuned. We don't know yet what the results are.
Another question.
I want to comment on that, though, because
sure.
Whenever you think about an incidence problem in economics, there's the elasticity of supply, it's also the elasticity of demand. One real big issue for people who are poor today is that they're trapped in the places that they live. And one of the really extraordinary effects about a UBI that you cannot produce with a jobs guarantee is that it actually allows people to move. It allows people to move to places that are a lot cheaper to live, and it also allows people to move to places that are going to be less impacted by the climate crisis. So we have a lot of people in the US living in floodplains and living in low-lying coastal areas. Only a UBI would make it possible for those people to reorganize and move to places that are going to be less impacted. I think that's very important. How do we know that this is true? We know that people who are already on the UBI, namely pensioners, people who have a guaranteed income, move to places where it's cheaper to live. That's already happening. So we know that people are mobile once they know that they have a reliable source of income.
Though they're moving in the opposite direction.
They're moving to places,
the coastlines and the warm temperatures.
Because they have warm temperatures, I think they're also moving to Arizona. That's pretty safe.
Would we see anytime you're talking about, especially people in poverty, there are people who prey on them. If you had a UBI, would we see check cashing places all of a sudden be giving advanced loans on the UBI, or not even check cashing places? Would Goldman Sachs offer me a lump sum for my lifetime cash flows?
There's a pretty simple fix to that is, I think almost all UBI proponents say that it's not pledgeable as collateral, meaning you could declare bankruptcy and immediately get it again, so people wouldn't write loans against it.
And of course, people do that anyway, right? They're already offering annuities, or they're already offering check cashing, or types of opportunities to spend income in ways that are maybe self-detrimental. I mean, I think the biggest worry among conservative skeptics of the universal basic income is that it would have the type of work effects on a mass scale that may not have been visible in the research to date. And what I find among the conservative intellectual movement, at least, and it does exist, it's very small, it's 12 people. They're very concerned that there are non-material benefits to work. And that is, work does not only provide you an income, but it provides you a social bond. And amidst all of the problems that we're discussing today, there are other problems in the United States, primarily the breakdown of institutions, the breakdown of social institutions, such as the family, religious affiliation, and community. And the worry is that if we were then to break down the institution of vocation, and do it, in some cases, purposefully, then we would lessen that social bond, and there would be non-material effects that would be negative in the views of many conservatives. Again, leading to why I believe that it would stand a very low chance of ever passing.
So,
Go ahead.
take the counterpoint of that. First of all, the research so far, and you have said, doesn't show big work effects, and I didn't mention that, but people have also looked at lottery winners, so not just small amounts, but huge amounts. And even these large amounts, despite the legend, have very small effects on work. In the end, in the long run, very few lottery winners, even winning hundreds of thousands of dollars, drop out of the labor force. So that's, for the evidence. But I think there's a deeper issue, which is even some small effects for some are really severe. I'm saying the effects are not large, maybe zero, but maybe just small. But for some people, even a small effect is bad because of the value, that's attached to what I often hear as the dignity of work. But I want us here to question this for a moment in thinking, why is paid market work the only way that you can manifest your dignity as a human being in society? What about going to church? What about contributing to your church? What about raising your children? There's all of those things that we could be doing that potentially UBI would facilitate. Like right now, I'm talking to religious leaders and they say it's so hard to essentially recruit people and keep the community together because everybody's so busy hustling out there in order to make a living. So, I want us to think, and I think we don't have enough evidence to say how big those effects would be, but how much would having some degree of financial security enable other socially valuable activities that are also potential sources of dignity?
And we have really strong evidence on that from the casino licenses for Native Americans. When those were given out, there was a lot of people saying, oh, it's just going to be used for drugs and alcohol. Well, the NBR has a great working paper from, I think, a year ago or so that really goes and documents how that was used to rebuild community institutions, the kind of community institutions that have resulted in civic engagement, that have resulted in people taking better care of their children, in investing in education, et cetera. So the very civic institutions that we would like to promote are the very ones that have been built with these kind of quote-unquote windfall type winnings. I think it's also important to remember that the idea that paid labor is the source of purpose and meaning in life is a very new idea. It's an idea that we introduced coincident with the industrial age. It's part of the promulgation of the Protestant work ethic. We lived for thousands of years under the agrarian age under a completely different set of values where your purpose in life came from following the rules that your respective religion laid out for you. So I think as long as we're caught in sort of thinking, oh, this is like we are supposed to be tweaking the industrial age here, and in the industrial age, purpose comes from work, as long as we're stuck in that sort of tweaking logic, I think we will miss the big picture.
But I hear a contradiction among UBI advocates, where on one hand they say, well, it's going to have no effect on work. We've looked at the studies. It's fine. Work is fine. And then on the other hand, you hear people saying, well, no, this will give labor more bargaining power. They won't have to take very low-paying jobs anymore. They'll have a flexibility. And now you're saying, oh, we can rebuild civic institutions and like at the John Maynard Keynes, we can sit around and do more poetry and more arts and all those sort of things. And those seem to be like, which one is it?
No, I don't.
We're going to keep our jobs or do more stuff?
No, I think both of those can be simultaneously true. So, first of all, where these studies do find effects is people will stay at home to take care of a sick child, for example. People will invest more time in their own health. So it does have effects on the margin. I think, a lot of studies find it has effects on the margin. The margins matter for bargaining power. The margins is what matter in economics. So just because you don't have a large aggregate effect, if you have a small marginal effect, that matters a great deal.
Just to be specific, people, including myself, have found sometimes some effects on hours. So some of the things one of the best studies is a study of lottery winners in Sweden. Why Sweden? Because they were able to get the data on the population of all Swedes. And so one of the key results there was that winning at the lottery $140,000 barely changed anything in the share of people who were working. I think it went from something like 77% to 75%, so a small effect. More commonly though, people took more time off from their job. They stayed in their job, they didn't quit their job, but they took more time off. So, the effects are subtle, but certainly it does seem like people feel more freedom to take time off when they need it, when they want it, and some of this time could be used potentially for these, socially beneficial activities.
I do slightly worry about the lotto comparison, though, because that's a windfall gain, right, at the end of the day, and UBI is something that would be, people would come to depend on it, right? It's a pension. Right. And so there, I think you would have, again, the politics of it would be slightly different because all of a sudden it's a benefit that once introduced will not be taken away. That is the history of the American welfare state. Mm-hmm. Once something is introduced, it cannot be taken away, and then people begin arguing for its expansion. So we're here at Columbia. It was a Columbia professor, Robert Merton, who in 1936 wrote a paper called The Unintended Consequences of Purposive Social Action. And so I'm channeling the ghost of Merton here on this panel, just to simply say that once introduced, even if the situation is so dire that we must think of radical possibilities, once introduced, the politics of a UBI, the financing of a UBI, the consequences of a UBI could change dramatically and in ways that we do not expect.
And I know a lot of you must be thinking, wait a minute, how exactly are we going to pay for this, and will this have effects on the budget? And in terms of our deficit, I will say that later in the day we're going to talk more specifically about the impact of deficits and spending, so we're kind of not tackling that right now. But I wanted to just quickly get an idea from you all, because we've been talking in sort of big picture, in big picture terms. How much money is enough? Like, how much is the right amount of money? Just give me a number.
I think it's somewhere like $800 to $1,000 a month per adult, and probably less for teenagers, and probably much less for younger children. And that gets you to roughly what currently is the US poverty line. So that number isn't kind of completely arbitrarily made up.
Do we know from the data? What makes sense?
Not really. I mean, I don't think there's necessarily a clear threshold, but I want to just pivot your question slightly to talk about, earlier you were asking the question, why do the UBI? Why not, if we have all these problems with low-income people or no-income people, what about focusing on them? And I think the critical thing there is that you can't see the UBI in isolation from the way it's financed. And without discussing is the financing too big, I want to point out that once you put them together, it can be a more or less progressive scheme. Because as was pointing out before, sure, we're going to give nominally the same amount to everybody. But if this is enabled by a progressive tax, practically speaking, really, this is a redistributive transfer towards low-income individuals. So as an example, because today is Green New Deal, if we think about the carbon tax, it turns out there's been a simulation by the Department of the Treasury on how a carbon tax would impact incomes. And essentially, it is quite highly redistributive in that the lowest 10% of the population would get way more out of a carbon tax dividend than they're paying in the carbon tax.
Yeah, because think of all those private jets.
Exactly. So basically, there is a strong correlation between income and the amount of carbon that you use through your flying, your SUV, your Mac mansions, and so on and so forth. And so the tax incidence of a carbon tax falls disproportionately on high-income people. And therefore, if high-income people pay more, but you return the same amount to everybody, on net, low-income people are getting much more out of it, and high-income people are paying a net contribution.
Though I would say that the most prominent UBI proposal today is presidential candidate Andrew Yang's, and while he does have a carbon tax in his broader policy scheme, he also is, I think, intellectually honest and says the only way to pay for all of these programs he's proposing is through the introduction of a value-added tax. And so that is a regressive tax. So would not be completely progressive under the most prominent system that we have. And then I think people would say, well, you're introducing a regressive tax in order to provide a benefit that is universal. So I think the critics would make much of that. And I would also say, again, to this question of substitution versus supplement, once you get, and I know we're saving the accounting until later in the day, which is good for us on this panel, but once you start saying UBI, once you start saying GND, once you start saying Medicare for all, the numbers get big very quickly. And the truth is, as I think has become manifest in the democratic debate, there is no way to pay for all of these programs simply relying on the progressive income tax structure that the United States has today.
All right, let's cut some things. So what should we cut? If we got a UBI, let's start to list off. Social Security, earned income tax credit, food stamps?
I'm personally in favor of completely recutting the existing welfare system because of many parts of it have such a detrimental impact on all sorts of aspects. You know, like food stamps are a terrible way for people to procure high quality food, for example. Like you can mostly get bad food when you're on food stamps. I mean, so this, I think there's a wholesale rearrangement that I do think is required. I also very much think that when we look at how to finance everything, we have to admit that we are creating money on an unprecedented scale at the moment. So since 2008, the Fed has extended its balance sheet by about $4 trillion. They tried to take some of it back. I don't know if you follow the repo markets, but it's not been going well, and they've been pumping it back out. And that money has been going to wealthy people like myself. It's why I can afford like a sub 3% mortgage on like the third house. We really, like when we talk about money, looking just at the government's balance sheet or income statement, I should say, and just looking at, you know, current year tax receipts and spending at a time when we've printed $4 trillion is just intellectually not honest.
So what would you cut? Well, I don't have a clear idea on that, but there is a principle, which is to think about what are things that are the most similar to UBI. So if you had a high UBI, what's most similar to UBI are cash-like programs like food stamps or earned income tax credit. So if you had to cut something, I suppose this would make the most sense because they are most similar, or something that would replace. But you wouldn't necessarily cut other things that are not similar or arguably are addressing additional needs that UBI isn't necessarily addressing, things like if you're disabled or health insurance. Certainly there's a strong point that my colleagues in the profession of economics make that you can't replace health insurance with UBI because it has a fundamental role to play in people's lives. So there are things that we can consider replacing, I think, because they're similar, like food stamps, which is more cash-like, and there are things like health insurance that it wouldn't necessarily make sense to replace with a UBI.
So,
and I want to add one more thing. That you can debate the exact numbers, but the recent work by Zuckman and Zayas and others shows that the effective tax rate that people of wealth have been paying has been declining like fairly dramatically over the last 30 plus years. So I think even just getting back to a tax system where people kind of pay the rate that's on the book would be like a huge gain. So I think before we go to cutting, why don't we go to where is some of that money going that we used to collect? And where is some of that money that we're printing going? Like, then I think we can have an honest accounting before we start about cutting a lot of things.
They will ask for cuts. We are going to take some questions in just a moment, but I just wanted to ask Matthew, how you're the emissary from Washington, how does this go down? Let's just say that everyone decides it's a good idea, and now we have to cut. at least something from the budget. What happens?
I mean, that's a big assumption, first of all. You know, what's striking is that the reason we're having this discussion at all, I think, is the prominence of Andrew Yang in the Democratic debate. And his kind of social media presence and popularity, I think, has driven him onto the debate stage and put him in a position where he is able to introduce UBI to a national audience. However, he is not in the top tier of presidential candidates on the Democratic side. It's still early, things can change. But the first thing you must have to get a UBI is a president who supports it. And what's interesting is that whatever the alternatives, as we can foresee them, things change, the magic 8 ball says remains to be seen, whatever the alternatives in 2020 we have, the most likely ones anyway, that's not the case. So, I mean, having a president is in some ways the easiest step, but that only begins your challenges because, again, if UBI, GND, M4A is not accompanied by major structural change to the constitutional order of the United States, they will quickly run into the same wall in Congress that prevented earlier reform efforts, or at least moderated some earlier reform efforts. Here I think of the Affordable Care Act, that made them in ways, fashioned them in ways that were ultimately disappointing to some of their most committed observers. So your first step, if you support UBI, is to get a president elected.
We have a microphone. Is there just one? A microphone in the middle of the room. If anyone would like to ask a question of our panel. Excellent. You can give us your name first.
Ken Kramer from Rushden Atlantic. This has been a great panel. I don't think anybody came into this room not knowing this was a complicated subject. We've been forced to confront on how many dimensions it is complicated. I'm also glad that the organizer said both sides have to be heard from. You know, thank you, Matt, as the leadoff conservative coming to what I suspect, despite the gray hair, is a left-of-center house. So we know that we've got complexities on implementation, you know, nature of, what is the nature of work, what is the nature of society, you know, what existing programs are we trading these for, oh yeah, how do you pay for it? And why now? Why is this moment different? And where I'm going with this is, I think that having heard all the issues, I'm still kind of going along with Robert is, yeah, the robots are going to take our jobs. That seems like the biggest driver. And Albert made the point that, well, we get to choose what kind of, you know, society we want to live in. My concern is that capital gets to choose what kind of society we want to live in. And to the extent that we have the 1% thinking, yeah, we do pretty well if robots keep our jobs, if robots take your jobs, you know, how well is our society going to work? You know, you look at the example of losing checks and balances between the executive and the legislative branches. So essentially, my concern is, you know, I think Trump became possible in part because 40 years of not getting a raise, which goes to income inequality because it's not like the economy isn't pumping out wealth. So how big an issue do you guys think the you know, income inequality is driving the timeliness of UBI?
Thanks.
Well, I think it's part of it. I think the more interesting inequality is the inequality of standing. And that is, rather than income inequality, I think a widespread global sense that voices are not being heard. And this is, again, across the political spectrum. It's the same, you see it with the BLM movement, but you also see it with the Trump movement. A sense that people's individual voice or dignity has not been respected by authorities, and therefore rebellion of some sort is necessary. And what's striking to me, just reading the headlines before this panel today, this is continuing. If you look at Catalonia, if you look at Hong Kong, if you look at Latin America, Obviously, Brexit has been ongoing. It's a purgatory. This sense that people's individual dignity has been aggrieved is widespread, and it's not stopping. And I'm not certain, from my perspective, that a UBI would be the thing that quieted it.
Anyone else on the?
I think let's leave the floor to more
Sure.
questions.
Good morning. Victor Lee. I'm reporting for Trade Post USA. A great panel, by the way. But my question was prompted by Albert's comment initially, and that has to go with the pace of change. So earlier inflection points in technology, let's say from foraging to farming, had several characteristics. Number one, it took time. Number two, it grew the economy. And number three, you would see personal benefit, i.e. more to eat, right? In terms of the issues the Green New Deal is trying to address, they really have none of that, right? We don't really have a lot of time. The changes necessary are potentially overwhelming, so difficult for people to grasp. And rather than getting a benefit, we're really trying to avert a catastrophe. So this question is kind of for Albert, but also for the panel. How do you sort of, assuming you can even get people to understand and agree that there's a problem, how do you rally the change, both among the population and among the institutions, necessary to make change in time?
Yeah, the question of the theory of change, I think, is a really important one. And I believe that the most promising model theory of change is one similar to the civil rights movement or the women's voting movement, which is ultimately nonviolent direct action. I do think we're on a timeline where waiting to, for the next presidential election, waiting for the next congressional election, et cetera, it's just the wrong timeline. Also, I'd like to point out that women obviously couldn't vote to give themselves the vote. So certain things you can only fix by actually being out there and causing a certain degree of visible disruption so that more people are focused on the severity and size of the problem.
Thank you.
Hi, this question is about scale. My name is Ben Moore. I'm a tiny architect. And so I don't discomfort anyone with the question. I am far, far to the left and far, far to the right, and it's hell. But anyway, and it's a lovely breakfast too. Thank you very much to the Richman Center. Anyhow, the question is about the magnitude of UBI and what strikes me as something quirky about it. I'm trying to imagine a world in which a guy's walking down the street with a top hat on the way to a really splendid restaurant, for an $800 meal. And a guy walks up to him on the street and says, "Buddy, can you spare $1 for a slice of pizza?" And somehow the arrangement becomes, okay, I'll tell you what, I'll give you $1 for a slice of pizza, and I'll come and have a slice of pizza for $1 with you, and then I'll go have dessert at the super fancy restaurant. That's what $1,000 a person, $12,000 a year in UBI seems like. I'm not saying I'm for it, I'm not saying I'm against it necessarily, I think it's inevitable, but it just, the question then finally is this rather quirky, everybody gets it whether you need it or not, in fact sort of a mask to diminish the kind of resistance that might arise in some out of a concern that there would be givers and takers, freeloaders and providers in a society, and somehow we're saying, oh, well, everybody gets it, so it's not like this is charity. We're all getting it. It's just it's like parking tickets or something.
Great question.
I think the fact that everybody gets it has symbolic as well as technical advantages. Symbolic is along the lines of what you were saying, because everybody gets it. There is more this idea that it's a form of human right, or at least a citizen's right, versus some form of charity, something that you can only get if you're in dire straits. But there is also a technical advantage when it comes to thinking about the coverage of our welfare system. A lot of people who in principle qualify for benefits end up not getting them. So something like a universal basic income does have the advantage that it can, put an end to some of the gaps in our welfare system where people who should be getting benefits aren't. So that's another more, technical advantage to it. But again, remember that how progressive it is overall very much depends on how we're financing it. So, there's a difference between the flat amount that everybody's getting and once you integrate the mode of financing of this benefit.
Matthew, do we ever feel like the only way you can get redistribution into the American system is to sort of hide it, to tuck it into Social Security or into someone's tax returns with earned income?
The tax code is probably the biggest driver of redistribution, and maybe even upward redistribution that we have today. I would actually the best way to get an entitlement is by making it universal. I mean, we have Social Security now for 80 years. We have had Medicare now for half a century. By the way, neither of those programs in tip-top financial shape. And yet, again, both of them have huge constituencies and that are indeed, in some cases, are arguing for their expansion. So I think a similar pattern would reveal itself if we were to have a UBI.
I do think there are two things we fundamentally have to get away from. We fundamentally have to get away from somehow trying to pin UBI as either left or right. I think this is sort of if you look at who has supported this idea over the time of history, it really runs completely the political spectrum. That's number one. Number two, trying to characterize it as like a cheap handout, I think flies in the face of all the evidence from all the trials where people make substantial changes in their lives. Substantial changes such as seeking out a new degree, getting that degree, then having a totally different job afterwards. So yes, there's one way of looking at it saying $1,000 a month is nothing. Another way of looking at it is, like I have very good friends of mine who live in Western Mass. They live substantially below $1,000 a month. They live amazing lives. They do amazing things. Many of us have benefited from some of their work because they've been, people have helped to try and keep the internet open in various forms. So I think this sort of like, oh, look at it through the eyes of Manhattan. No, you don't have to live in Manhattan when you have a universal basic income. You can live anywhere, and you can live an amazing life that's enabled by this. The power of the walk-away option to change people's life, to walk away from a bad city, a bad job, a bad spouse, for example, is quite extraordinary. And I think that we have all the evidence that that is what actually happens. So this characterization as it being a cheap handout, I just would strongly reject.
We are getting close to our time, so if we can get our questions quickly.
I'm Diane Baker. I'm a community member, and my question is a lot of what Albert was saying. If people had a sense of basic economic security, might the economy benefit tremendously from this? For example, people not having to hold on to jobs they hate and perhaps starting new businesses. People who can't afford to be teachers now migrating into education and upgrading the entire educational system. Might a general strengthening actually offset this at some point?
All of that, yes. Yes, and yes.
There's a funny thing about security, though. The more you have, the more you want. Does anyone ever really feel secure? And this is why, again, this contradiction I detect in Andrew Yang's platform, which is to say, UBI is going to do all these wonderful things. However, we're going to keep the benefits so low that it won't do any of the negative things that it could possibly do. And the second you have the benefit, people are going to want more, because the truth is, even the $12,000 a year will not be enough for people to feel truly secure.
I will also say that this is a benefit that would make more of a difference in the lives of low-income earners, because then, there's a real potential of saying, well, I don't like this job, let me get on UBI. Maybe it's a bit less, but at least I'm out of this terrible job. It won't make much of a dent in the bargaining power of higher earning individuals, and if we want to do something about this, and I have a bunch of work in this area, we have to rethink the institutions and the relative power of workers versus others, in setting pay. And that's, a whole other kind of work. So UBI by itself isn't going to do it in terms of giving more bargaining power to workers who are above, a low level of pay.
I just want to suggest for a moment, though, that the framing of if we give this to people, they're just going to want more, I think it's also historically problematic. That was also one of the arguments used against giving women the franchise. It's like, what's the next thing they're going to want? I mean, it's just a bad argument. Humans don't really operate that way.
There's a distinction between civil rights and economic rights. And the civil rights is one thing, economic rights is another thing.
This is why this is a civil rights issue. It's not an economic issue.
Hi, Phil Youngberg, investment professional. What is the view that regardless of this debate, UBI will be required in the next economic downturn or financial crisis? given we are at the lower bound and limitations of monetary policy?
Oh, interesting.
Well, this is why I mentioned repeatedly the creation of money. I do very much believe that a much better way to deal with a downturn is quantitative easing for the people instead of quantitative easing for the wealthy, right? So if you're going to quantitatively ease, give the money to the people who are going to go spend it.
Wow, our first applause. Quantitative easing for the people. Matthew, briefly.
Again, it depends on who the president is. If the recession happens in President Warren's first year, maybe she'll take a look at it. But I have to say that she'll be so occupied with these other structural changes that she supports that it probably won't rise to the level of congressional action.
See if we can fit another question in.
Yeah, good morning, Steve Feldman. I'm a graduate of the business school. In terms of economic security, are there any estimates out there of what it'll cost if we do nothing? So in other words, one of the articles for today mentions, the costs of adding all these programs, 53 trillion, 90 trillion. What happens if we do nothing, is my question.
Personally, the biggest do-nothing issue that we're facing is not this, it's the climate crisis.
No,
this is the place where we're not doing anything relative to the scale of the problem. So I think all bets are off if we don't solve this problem. And I think that's partially why this is about the Green New Deal. So that is the thing that we're most behind, and I don't even want to attach an economic number to it because we're going to kill 1 billion people or more. It doesn't matter I don't know what number you want to attach to that.
Thank you.
So as we wrap this up, I think we have just a couple minutes left. Oh, we have one more. I'm sorry. I didn't see you.
I'm Valerie. I come from the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation across from the business school. And we are working on the Green New Deal in different ways, looking mostly at climate change as a sort of, through a material, environmental lens, and also looking at metrics, obviously. I'm interested, so thanks for a great panel. I'm very interested in hearing your thoughts about what other metrics could be involved in the idea of public order past the idea of capital metrics. So sort of thinking about, what are ways to structure social order that are more in tune with our material entanglement with the world and also our social entanglement with each other. Are there, is this something that you think, your conversation that can exist in the public order based on some of this research around universal basic income and the way sort of capital numbers and economic metrics are very limited in regulating or social hierarchies, but also our relationship to the environment. I think as Westerners who impose or who sort of lead the way for the idea of the quote-unquote developing world, it's a conversation that seems relevant and important. I'm interested in hearing your thoughts.
So I think this just briefly has very much to do with the idea of democracy. So this is beyond just economics, even though economics is my beat. But as was mentioned, one of the findings with UBI from the Indian tribes is that it increased political participation. So that's something that we should think about, as well as in general, how much the people have decision power over various aspects, including wages, including environmental policy versus other actors. So there we're a bit back to structural changes in the way decisions are made in society, and just giving people money, while important, isn't necessarily going to achieve some increase in democracy and broader participation in our society towards deciding on these various issues.
One more question, a quick one, our final question.
Richard Paul Richman, graduate of Columbia Business School. Several years ago, Finland tried this experiment of implementing UBI and then discontinued it. My question is, what lessons were learned from that exercise and how applicable are they to our country?
The two things wrong with this. The Finnish experiment wasn't actually a basic income experiment. It started out as one, but then it was rapidly stripped down to being just given to people unemployed, so it was not actually a universal basic income experiment. It also wasn't discontinued. It ran its originally planned length. It was not renewed past that. Nonetheless, despite both of those things, actually the findings are quite positive. So it's in the long line of people trying to test UBI, testing it poorly, and still finding it's actually positive.
And just one remark about the previous question, which is somewhat related to this, which is does seem to be some relation between material deprivation and social decomposition, right? And if you think about communities where the jobs go away, you see very soon after the social institutions begin to decay as well. The problem, and it's a big problem, is that this does not seem to be reversible chemical reaction, which is to say, there's less evidence that by introducing money into these communities who have lost their economic horizon, you will suddenly see the rebirth of the civic institution.
I think the study of the Native American tribes really speaks to that not being the case. It speaks to where people who had abandoned all hope and money allowed them to reconstruct things.
I think there are plenty of Indian reservations, Native
American
reservations
you should read the NBR study.
That's not the case. And by the way, that don't have casino licenses. Not everyone can have a casino in their
No, but that's
in their
why it
neighborhood.
made it kind of a natural experiment, because some got the license, others didn't. And so there's an actual paper that analyzes this, and it shows that the benefits were overwhelmingly positive, exactly in kind of the institution rebuilding.
The counterexample would be enterprise zones introduced into many American cities, where the economic incentives are created, and you don't see the type of civic revitalization you claim that is visible in the American
Because
Indian
the enterprise
studies.
zones don't actually give the money to the people who need to spend it.
You can see why we've been discussing this for 200 years, and we'll see if there's 200 years more. I want to thank the panel so much. This was fantastic. And thank you all for the great questions. This bodes well for a fascinating day, so stick around. Lots more policy to come.